everyone. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for all of you for joining us today. We're really honored to have a special guest that I think you're all really going to appreciate, and that's Nick Buxton. Um, Nick is going to speak on a just peace on a burning planet, why our collective survival depends on rethinking the military. He's an incredible international activist. I ran into him and meetings that were from activists from all over the world. He's a communications specialist, a researcher on multiple topics, including militarism and climate change. He currently works as a Knowledge Hub coordinator at TNI, that's the Transnational Institute, which is an international research think tank that works for the people. Isn't that nice? We hear about think tanks all the time, and they're usually finding underhanded ways to manipulate all of us. So he's doing the opposite work. He's a co-editor of the influential book, The Secure and Dispossessed, how the military and corporations are seeking to shape a climate changed world, and regularly produces research on the impact of military spending on climate action. His latest report, Climate Crossfire, explains how NATO's 2% military spending targets contribute to climate breakdown. He also has a new online book called Capitalism, the State of Power for 2025. So JEC, that's Unitarian Universalist for Just Economic Community, and our task force, which is Peace, Equity, and Climate. Warmly welcome you, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us, and go right ahead.
Are we going to do a round of introductions, or should I just kick straight in?
Oh, sure. Terry, you want to start? We'll just go around.
Okay, I'm Terry Lohman. I'm co-chair for UU's for Just Economic Community, and I'm in Ames, Iowa. We winter in Miami, and I just came home a few days ago. When we got here, it was like 85 degrees that day. Now it's more like 30 degrees at night, but and not that hot during the day. That was exceptional. Oh, and I'm in Iowa, and we always give you weather reports, by the way. It's just our connection to agriculture, I believe.
Lucy, you want to go ahead?
I missed your intro because my phone rang, but is it just saying where we're from?
Whatever you like. Give yourself a few seconds there. I mean, you can say more than where you're from.
Okay, I'm from Salem, Oregon. Very interested in any ways that we can help our planet. I'm very much into the trees, and any pollution is a detriment and so forth.
Mona?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'm in Seattle, and it's pouring down rain and 50 degrees here now. So I always say if you think 10 degrees on either side of 50, you pretty much have the weather most of the time in Seattle. And so anyway, I'm a member of UJC almost since it started, and so I don't know what else to say. I'll call on Dick.
Yeah, Mona forgot to say she's worked the nuclear issues for decades.
Right, yeah.
She's one of our great experts at the Bangor Submarine Base.
Very active in Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action,
Right.
which is over on Paulsbo and the coast along the Salish Sea. And I've been a member of Ground Zero since like the early 70s, I think it was, way back.
Yeah, so I've been like on the board of UJC for 15, 20 years, something like that, and work in economic justice. But I also work in Seattle. I work with Sierra Club and transportation and land use, work on climate issues, racial issues with UUs from Multiracial Unity Action Council, quite a variety of things. So I took early retirement from Boeing a number of years back to become a full-time citizen activist as sort of a second or retirement career.
So everybody that's spoken so far is on the board of UUJEC. David Delk is here. David's also on the board. David, would you like to speak? And then we'll have others speak.
Well, I wasn't really
Introduce yourself.
I wasn't really expecting to speak, so I'll just say
just
hi. I'm glad
intro.
to be here.
Just an intro. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm David Delk. I live in Portland, Oregon. I have been a UUer for 20 years or something like that at mostly at First Unitarian in Portland, and I am a member of the Peace Action Group as well as the Economic Justice Action Group at both at the Unitarian Church, and I have been an activist for limiting big money in politics in the state of Oregon, within the state of Oregon for probably 20 years. I've been a chief petitioner on all of the initiatives for doing that in Oregon for that period of time. So, and then you see behind me a picture of some of the signs we made for a once a week sign holding, informational sign holding that we do at the east end of the Burnside Bridge, which is a very high traffic area. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Let's see. I don't think we have anybody else here from the board. Tina, do you want to, you introduced yourself a little before, but a lot of people didn't get to hear from you. So you want to?
Yeah, I just saw this on the church email. I work at Sky Island UU, which is a church in Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is about half an hour from Tombstone. So we're southeast of Tucson and Phoenix, but higher altitude, better climate, and a very, very red county. So that's, and yeah, and we don't go, our climate is like, it can change 40, 50 degrees when monsoon hits within 2 minutes. You know, we get really hot and then the rain hits and it drops. And in the winter, we have snow sometimes. And yeah, so we had frost last week, which was weird. Anyway.
Oh, really glad you could join us. Ruth, I think you're from Ohio.
Yes, I moved from Iowa a year and a half ago, but I'm in Ohio now. So the guy from Ames, I mean, hey, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, but I also lived in Arizona for a couple of decades. And in Flagstaff, I know about the monsoons and the change in the weather and all that kind of stuff.
More extreme up there.
In Flagstaff, of the couple decades that I lived in Flagstaff, the lilac blossoms, apple blossoms didn't freeze once in all those years, right?
Well, thank you for joining us, Ruth. Really glad to have you. Let's see. Oh, Wayne, would you like to introduce yourself?
It's Wynn, and I live in Gainesville, Georgia, Northeast Georgia, member of Georgia Mountains Unitarian Universalist Church in Dahlonega. I am on the Faith and Action Committee with our church. There's 2 of us that have been active with the State Legislative Action Network for the last year and a half. And now that we have a new Social Justice of North Georgia group forming. We have not been so much involved with climate action. It's mostly been get out the vote and the state legislative issues, and just wanted to maybe learn a little bit more about climate justice.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm glad you could join us. Eric, would you like to say a word?
Yes, it's Eric Lawson from Saratoga Springs, New York. member of the Unitarian Church here, and also a member of the Adirondack Council Board of Directors. I continue to get involved in groups like this of a liberal orientation, hoping for inspiration, hoping for new insights, hoping that people have got perspectives that I have not heard previously that will give me inspiration and cause me to continue to move forward with enthusiasm against what seems to be an overpowering conservative onslaught that's taking place and destroying our country as well as our climate.
Well, I hope you came to the right place. Our speaker is really remarkable. There's somebody here I don't recognize. There's a big square with an M. Who might that be?
I think they introduced themselves in the chat. Martha.
Oh.
Yeah, I have the microphone on though, if you would like me to say hello.
Sure.
Yes, please. Can you identify where you're from and a little about yourself? I'm in southern Maine in Kennebunk. And one of the things you might put on your list to do someday is look at World Beyond Wars, War and the Environment might be enlightening. And since you're all Unitarians, it looks like, let me tell you what I have scheduled at the local Unitarian Church. A series of films will be shown from 4 to 6 p.m. on Sunday, May 25th, Memorial Day evening at the First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church in Kennebunk. This free event will highlight the human and environmental costs of war, describe the work of a Maine artist who paints portraits of Americans who model our commitment to social justice, and illustrate how one country's residents work together nonviolently to achieve independence without a single loss of life. So that's my Unitarian relationship. Awesome. Wonderful. Glad you could join us. Rudyard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Rudyard. Sorry I was joining late. I'm in Albany, New York, and I work in renewable energy. Amazing, wonderful.
And then I see we have two amazing people here from Veterans for Peace, Climate Crisis and Militarism Project. One being Gary Butterfield, who just spoke to us, I think last month. Gary, do you want to remind folks of who you are?
Hi, thanks, Cindy. Thanks for putting this program on. I'm a member of First UU in San Diego and also of Veterans for Peace's Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, where we talk about the military's overwhelming contribution to the climate crisis.
Awesome. And Jim Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Jim Ryan with and on the steering committee with Cindy and Gary in the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, streaming in from Detroit, Michigan.
Woo! All right. Is there anyone I've missed? Okay, Nick, do you want to say a word about yourself before you launch?
Sure.
Some of these people didn't hear the intro.
It's my turn. Well, firstly, it's wonderful to hear from, just see the patchwork of people from all over the states. So it's really nice. There's a real representation from different parts of the states, and that's really great to see. And to have a conversation with you all. I'm based in Davis, California. As you can tell from my accent, I wasn't born here. I'm from the UK originally, and I grew up with parents who were quite involved in the peace movement in the 80s. I was very involved in activism around the Iraq War. So before I even dreamed of coming to the US, I was arrested outside a US military base in the UK. And then got very much involved in climate action after that. And in a sense, what I've done is more recently is pulled together the threads of my early beginnings as a peacenik child with my activism around climate change. So that's what I want to share with you a bit today. Some of the things I've done. I work for this Transnational Institute, as Cindy said. It's an international institute which was set up in the 70s, really to support social movements with research, and has lots of different programs, but one of its programs is around issues around militarism and war. And so that's one I've been particularly active in. So I'm going to share some slides. I think I'll speak for about half an hour. We'll see how that goes. And then I think we'll have time for questions, answers, discussion, ideas, strategy, whatever. But hopefully my beginnings will kind of give some food for a good conversation. Let's see if this
Okay.
works.
Terry.
Yeah.
I think Nick wants to show his slides.
Yeah, I think I can do it.
He has
It's done.
control.
Yeah. Can everyone see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, this is what I decided to give this talk on, is Just Peace on a Burning Planet, and that's actually a shot of the military, this is just above in Hurricane Katrina, surveilling the scene. And I think we can remember some of the scenes that kind of really, I think, woke up a lot of America, both to the issue of climate change. We're now talking how many years ago? 2 decades ago, and also the response, the inequities that could be exposed in a moment like this, and how people who were just trying to survive could end up being kind of almost militarized and surveilled. So it seemed quite a fitting image to kind of open this conversation.
Hey, Nick, I think we're seeing from the presenter view. I don't know if that's what you intended.
No, I didn't. Let's just try and escape that. Okay. Let's just start from the beginning. Does this show just the slide?
Just you.
And that doesn't show the slides at all.
You're not sharing screen right now, Nick. You need to go back and share screen.
Sorry, sometimes
it isn't the slide that, the slide that you just showed us isn't the one you showed when we started. It was just you, Terry, and I.
Let's try once more. It worked when we tested it.
No, so now we just see you.
Yeah, I'm going to see if now. Let's see if this works.
Yeah, there you go. Well, this is at least we get the.
That's a little better.
Yeah.
That's a lot better.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, you're in.
Okay.
You're on.
Okay, and everyone can see the slides?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I wanted to, as I was thinking about what to prepare, we're in this kind of obviously kind of crazy moment, and I think we're all experiencing it, where the news every day it kind of ricochets us around, and we're not quite sure how to respond to what we're seeing or hearing, what's the kind of best response. And I feel that one of the things that I want to do here, and which I think is useful for us in these kind of moments, is to kind of look at not just at what is dominating the news, but also kind of some of the longer term trends that have got us here, and help both explain this moment, but also can kind of guide our strategy, because we can get distracted by the noise, but not actually the kind of underlying trend. And that's why I wanted to present these 2 charts, because I think they're really important to understand this moment and why and where we need to have a lot of focus on. And the first, of course, at the top is military spending, which you can see has more than doubled since the mid-1990s. And it's now starting to, after a little dip in the early 2010s, is starting to kind of go up and accelerate, particularly in the last 10 years. And then you can also see the other crescendoing curve, which is even steeper, which is the one of greenhouse gas emissions, which have increased also dramatically since the mid-1990s. And what I want to show in these things is that there are both connections between these charts. They interconnect, but they also mean that how we think about safety in this new world, which is both a climate changed world and an increasingly militarized world, is going to be very much interconnected, and we need to have a kind of collective response to this. Does that switch to my, sorry, there's an issue with the, I'm going to ignore the, can you see, are you seeing the presenter notes now or the slides?
We're seeing the slide.
Okay, good.
Why we need to tackle militarism.
Yeah. So I want to kind of just to go through 4 things here, why we need to tackle militarism to achieve climate justice. And the first is because the military itself is a big source of emissions. The second reason we'll look at later is why it's very much the two are very much embedded together. Military economy and a fossil fuel economy have deep links, structural links. The third is that militarism is increasingly diverting the attention and our potential for collaboration for climate action. And the third thing is that militarism will increasingly lead to what I call climate maladaptation, or you could call climate injustice. So if we look at the first thing around the emissions, this is what many people, including activists in this room, have called the elephant in the room, because we don't often hear about the military actually being a polluter themselves. But if the world's militaries were a country, it would have the 4th highest carbon footprint, if you see there, after China, United States, and India. One estimate shows that the military now accounts for 5.5% of total global emissions, and that's more than civil aviation and shipping combined. So it's a significant contributor to global emissions, and yet it's also one that is hardly accounted for, because the military were actually granted an exception in some of the climate negotiations that went on, that were really from the very beginning. In Kyoto, Al Gore, amongst others, carved out an exception from the military from being counted in the accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. And even now that has been partially undone, it's still voluntary. And we still have a very impartial view of how much emissions are, because it's considered a national security issue. But one estimate shows it's 5.5%. And of course, the US is the biggest elephant of all. This is slightly dated, but the figure hasn't changed greatly. But US expenditure in 2022 was more than the next 10 countries combined. So when we look at global military emissions, we know that the US, with its outsized what's called a carbon boot print rather than a footprint, it is much bigger for the US than most of the world's rest of the economies, and completely outscales them. And of course, the US has largely been working particularly within the NATO alliance, and we also did some estimates around the NATO's collective military carbon footprint. And this is just NATO's military forces, so it doesn't include the arms industry and other parts of the military industrial complex. But this would rank NATO as the world's 40th biggest carbon polluter out of 196 nations. And one of the problems with this is that this is not a problem that is diminishing, but it's a problem that's growing. And one of the things that we've been trying to track is that, of course, if you increase, we've got this huge thrust now to increase military spending. And we all know Trump has, and even some of the responses to what has happened in Ukraine has been to push the European nations and the European members of NATO to drastically increase their military emissions. There's been a lot of pressure from the US to its NATO partners to say you must have a minimum of 2% of your GDP spent on military, on the military, 2% of the military. And the thing about that spending means it will also come with increased emissions. So we tracked what a 2% GDP target would mean if everyone adopted it, both globally and then based on the military. And you can see globally, a 2% minimum target would lead to quite a substantial growth by 2028, and a significant growth also in terms of NATO. And this was done a couple of years ago. Now some of the European nations are talking about a 5% GDP target. So this would push emissions even bigger. So at a particular moment when we really need to be reducing emissions, the real pressure is to increase military spending, and therefore that would increase military carbon emissions at a particularly important moment when we need to reduce it. And we can see this and these are just when you're talking about military operations outside war. When war happens, these accelerate at an even greater rate. What we do know is that war is a huge polluter, because of course, as soon as you have a war, you have all the air responses, the uses of bombs, and then you have the destruction and the whole cost of rebuilding. When they just calculated that just in the first 60 days of the war on Gaza, it generated the amount of emissions which was equivalent to 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. And that was just in the first 60 days. So I haven't seen more recent data, but you can imagine it's far bigger right now. Similarly, in Ukraine, we saw something similar where they just in the first 18 months, it produced a huge amount of carbon emissions similar to those of a country like Belgium. And one of the responses, of course, to this has been from the Pentagon, from defense industries, and from the arms industry, is that we're going to start to green our operations. And this was particularly a rhetoric that you would hear under the Biden and the Obama administration. And so you saw military bases, for example, starting to put solar panels. There were also efforts to look at kind of hydrogen in vehicles. But one of the difficulties that they have is that most of the military emissions come from mobility and equipment, and they're used in operations and exercises. And it's mostly jet fuel. And it's very, very hard to find alternatives to oil, to gasoline for particularly jets, but tanks, ships, and so on, because you can't electrify those things. As we know, we still don't have an electrified civil aviation fleet, and we certainly don't have one for the military jets, which use far more fuel than a typical jet. And instead, what we're seeing is the opposite going on. So NATO's main fighter plane right now is the F-35, and that replaced the F-16 and is increasingly being adopted by more and more NATO members. And that consumes 60% more fuel than its F-16 predecessor. So we're actually going in the opposite direction of greening the military. And given that these jets often have like a 30-year lifespan, you're locking in those carbon emissions for some time to come. So that's one of the big reasons, and one that I think I know some of you are very familiar with already, is that we have to point to the Pentagon. The Pentagon is a climate polluter, and it's very difficult to change that right now. The other three reasons. I mean, the other reason I want to go into now is that the way that the fossil fuel economy and the military economy are really quite closely embedded together. And I think this is one of the things that shows it, that basically the biggest polluters are the most militarized nations. Most of the most powerful industrialized countries grew because of their access. If they didn't have it directly produce it, they got access to oil. And they also used that wealth to create military. And then the military also ensured the access to the oil. So the two things have very much kind of fed off each other. So once you have so the things are very deeply embedded. They're very much the same. And you can see this in the way also that the military infrastructure has gone around. The US has 800 plus military bases, and you can see where they are by the size of the circles. And you can see that they are particularly big and dominant in areas like the Middle East, so access to oil and gas. They're also in the Far East, which is about access to shipping lanes, as well as extraction of resources. You've got big ones around the shipping lanes, around the Suez Canal, and so on. So that the military infrastructure has been built basically to ensure this access to resources. And so this is another way that these two things very map closely together. And you were hearing more and more these days about the kind of new critical minerals, the new critical wars, the wars around new resources. It's often called critical minerals, and that's very much driving some of the fights that we're seeing right now. I mean, there's a reason why Trump talks about Greenland, because it is seen as a source of critical minerals. Panama, because it is a critical shipping lane for transporting these minerals. And the competition with China is also because, and the friction with China is because of their access to these minerals. Much of it, particularly in the last administration, was talked about in terms of these minerals are critical for the green transition. But when we've actually dug into where most of the critical minerals are going, they're more often going to the military industry, the arms industry, than they are to the green industry. And so in some ways, this talk about them needed for the green transition is partly true, but it's also obscuring the fact that it's much more seen as significant and important, and is much more being driven by the military and security industry. So I want to get onto the third thing, which is how militarism is actually diverting attention and collaboration for climate action. So we've got this moment that we have this huge surge in military spending at a time when we really need urgent action on climate change. And these two things are very much directly clashing right now. So this is a chart from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. And what you'll see here is the way that the emissions, that's tracking the emissions, which have been going up. And then you see the green line going down, which is what the emissions would have to do, so fall dramatically, if we were to keep temperature increases below 1.5 degrees by 2030. What you see in the two blue lines at the top is the top blue line is the bottom blue line, sorry, the slightly fainter one is where people have pledged to reduce their emissions by. So you can see a very slight dip, but nowhere near as steep as what's needed. And then the slightly darker blue line is actually the pledges, but not is the actual policies and action, as in not just what they pledged to do, but where are the policies to back it up. Because one thing is a promise, another thing is an actual policy to deliver it. And there you can see basically all it means is a flattening of the curve, but no reduction whatsoever. So, and this is important because every year that you fail to act, you lock in carbon into the atmosphere that can take 100 years to remove. So we really have this very small window now of 5 years for drastic reductions, which really demands collaborative action. It involves putting climate change above everything else. It involves making climate change the security of the issue of the day. But what we're having instead is a real diversion from that. And one of the ways that is being diverted is the money. So while we've had this huge increase in terms of money for global military spending, in 2022 it was 2.2, and now it's 2.4 in 2024 trillion. This is the money that's been promised for climate finance to help countries, especially the developing countries, both adapt to climate change and to mitigate, as in to act on climate change, has not been delivered at all. And it's a tiny amount of what's been spent on the military. When we calculated this a few years ago, the richest countries are spending 30 times as much on military spending as climate finance for the world's most vulnerable countries. And this figure is also likely to have got worse since then. And when we calculated what it would mean if NATO all spent 2%, you would need an extra $2.5 trillion of spending. It would mean a total of 12 trillion being spent by NATO members by 2028, which is a huge amount of money compared to that 100 billion we're saying has still not been met for the poorest countries. And you can see all the different things that amount of money, just that difference, the 2.4 trillion would pay for. or no, this is the 11 trillion would pay for. It would pay for the commitment of climate finance that was made at the Paris Agreement back in 2018 for 118 years. It would provide 11 years of financing for all the lower middle income countries. It would provide climate adaptation countries for adaptation costs for the lower middle income countries for 34 years. So there's a diversion directly of money that was really needed for climate action, particularly for the world's most vulnerable countries, that is instead going towards the military. And the sad situation is this is getting worse. And it's the bottom headline you'll see there is one around Hegseth, who of course announced when he came to power that he was going to cut all the Defense Department's climate programs. But you can see it more broadly happening in other parts of the world. The UK famously has cut, which used to be a world leader on humanitarian aid, has cut its spending in order to increase military spending. It's happening right throughout European Union as well. And of course, once you get this escalating arms race where if someone increases their arms spending, then of course it leads to a response on the other side. So it leads to this ratcheting up of defense spending in this critical period in this decade where we need climate action. And the last thing I want to kind of touch on is my concern, and this goes back to the book that Cindy mentioned that I worked on in 2015, which is how if we start to strengthen the military and invest considerably in the military at a time of increasing climate breakdown, then of course the military will become one of the default institutions for responding to climate crisis. And I have concerns about that as we looked into this issue, because we looked into the Pentagon's plans, the UK military, or many different industrialized nations' militaries to look at what their plans were for climate crisis. And it raised real issues and concerns. I think one thing, we're hearing now that there's a lot of kind of climate denialism from Trump and the kind of decision not to not mention the word climate change, which is definitely a shift from what we had under Obama and Biden. But it's true that even for a long time that the military has not been a place of climate denialism. So it's been seen, therefore, in some ways in a more positive light. So the first climate security report that really looked at the national security implications of climate change came out in 2003. So, over 20 years ago. There have been many strategies since then, particularly under the Obama administration, but also under Biden. And then that led to a kind of many different countries, the UK, Germany, Australia, many different countries have kind of adopted what are kind of called climate security plans. And it even continued, even though the language shifted a little, it did continue under the first Trump 1.0, his first administration. But when you look at these strategies, they really see it through one lens, which makes sense. It's the lens of the military, which is climate change is secure. We need to have, how do we ensure security against the threats that will be created by climate change? And the language became very much that climate change was a threat multiplier, that it would make threats to the US increase. And therefore, the strategies were around really became in kind of three areas. One is how do we reduce the military vulnerabilities? So if you see the picture before, that's a flooding of a US airbase. So the military has a lot of its, especially military air bases at sea level. So they are affected directly by climate change. But they also face it in terms of kind of troops in areas of really extreme heat. And there was also just a concern around what Mattis called the tether of fuel, where they discovered in places like Iraq that the dependence on oil and gasoline made them very vulnerable when insurgents would tackle a fuel convoy, for example, because that would be a way of, without the fuel, they couldn't operate. So it was seen as a vulnerability. So it was very much the concern there wasn't really about climate change per se. It was around how this would affect the military's capacity to operate. The second thing you'll see in many of these strategies is how do they prepare and anticipate for climate impacts, and how will this affect the political and military environment in which the US military, which has a very large global bootprint, operates. And the third thing was like, how do we defend military and corporate assets that could result as a result of climate instability? And the big question we asked in the book that we pulled together, really, that came out is like, whose security are we talking about? What we saw increasingly, particularly in the military strategy, is that they were most concerned about supply chains, so shipping routes, borders came through very strongly. How do we secure borders? Maritime choke points, critical economic, energy, and agricultural hubs, and their concerns around it fueling, like, increasing terrorism and radicalization. So that was the lens that came to it, and the question is who's been included in that and who's not. And what we see increasingly, I think, is that this security narrative around what is security started to impact on all areas of what I'd call coercive spending. So these are all charts of global spending on the military, then on policing, then on prisons, on intelligence, and on border. And you can see the curve is going up for everything. But we saw this in other ways as well, that increasingly people were talking about food security, water security. Everything came through the lens of security. And one of the areas we saw that most strongly, and this is true of both the Democrat and Republicans of all parties, both left and right in the European Union and the US, is a huge increase in border spending. Border spending more or less there on the EU side and also on the US side. And you can see on the right-hand chart both the border spending under Republican presidents and under Democrat presidents, according to the colors. And you can see in both cases the trend is consistently upwards. And behind all of this, of course, is a really booming industry. And so these are all companies who really benefit, not just from military spending, but from border spending, from police spending, from security spending in general. And many of these companies have diversified. So Airbus, Northrop Grumman are not just ones winning big military contracts, they're also winning big border contracts as well. And one of the trends we're seeing, particularly in recent years, which is also adding to this, is technology companies are coming in. So Google and Microsoft are starting to get strong tie-in to the military industry as well. And they're all booming from this increased focus on security. So I kind of want to end with where we're at now, because I think in some ways Trump seems like a kind of something very different and an aberration. But in other ways, I would say he's the kind of extreme result of this whole security narrative. Because my sense is that over the last 2 decades, we've had kind of two really dominant ideologies, which have been true of the US, but also much of the developed world, which is one of neoliberalism, that we need to remove limitations on the exercise and the accumulation of wealth and of corporate power, and that has led to a growing power for corporations in US politics, also in European politics, and has led to the huge inequality, but also this moment where we have a huge power that billionaires have in the US economy. And then we also have this narrative of security, which particularly since 2001 has become a dominant narrative here. that initially it was targeted against Muslims, but it's increasingly been targeted against migrants. And Trump really became the kind of one who kind of gave voice to that in the most kind of open and naked and brutal way. But he really fueled that kind of thing of this things that had been building up with a lot of power behind them, both structural and economic power. Initially, as we remember, in the first administration, the Muslim ban being his first act, and now, of course, the deportation being his main strand. So I think we have to understand that he is part of this result of this rise of the security discourse. And although Trump has at times spoken out against war, I think picking up on some people's anger and distrust that came out of the US wars in most recent years. In reality, both in his first administration and we can all see it in the second administration, he's done nothing to restrain the military. In fact, recently they were announcing that they want to increase from 880 billion to 1 trillion Pentagon budget, and that doesn't include all the military spending. So we're talking about at least something like 1.5 trillion if you add things together. And we can also see it in his in some of his other rhetoric, his direct threats to use military force to control Greenland and Panama, his use of the military to go down to the border, and of course, most recently, his strikes in Yemen. So I think what the shift really is that there is less attachment to global alliances. So he doesn't have the same belief in alliances like NATO, but the exercise of US military power is something that he definitely wants to continue and is very much strongly tied to, and which has a lot of power within his administration. So I think this raises the challenge that really we're, in some ways, I guess this presentation is saying is that we've got some historical trends that have led to this moment. And we're going to need to respond in a way that both addresses how he continues that, and also how these things have been enabled as before. And I just I really wanted to open up the conversation here for everyone to kind of, and there's great people on this call like Jim and Nance and Cindy and others who are also working on this issue. So I'd love to have their inputs as well. But these are some just when I put some initial thoughts about this into kind of some first responses. This is what I think are some of the things that I encourage UU members to do, because I think UU members have very much looked at these things holistically, the kind of long trajectory of justice and injustice. And so I think has a really important role to play here. One of the things that has always come up for me is that the word security. And I think we need to challenge and question that word and always ask the question, whose security? Because inevitably, you are talking about one security at the expense of others. And usually you're talking about the security of those who already have wealth and power rather than those who don't. And the image that you see on the backdrop there is a standing rock. So there, the security was around the security of an oil firm, an energy firm that recently sued Greenpeace for billions. And they had no interest of the securities of the native people who lived on the land and whose water security, whose food security, and everything was going to be undermined by this pipeline. So I think that's one role we always have. I think there's one of the dangers of security is it's a term that can mean so many things. Some people understand it as like their security of their house, their home. But often what we're talking about is national security, and that means a set of particular interests. The other thing I think is really important is to bring this issue of military spending into different conversations and into different partnerships locally, in papers, in the church, in groups. There's a lot of talk about recently, and I think some groups have been doing some stuff. There were cuts by Doge, wasteful spending, but no actual cuts of the Pentagon. And besides its involvement and its oversized blueprint, the Pentagon has famously not passed any audits it's ever had of its operations, and yet continues to grow continuously. So those are the kind of questions we can ask about why are we spending this money when people can't afford a home or don't have enough to eat in our own community. The other thing I think is to bring these issues into other things that we're involved in. Some of us are involved in climate action, and I hope this gives you some tools to talk about that with climate groups that you might be involved in and why it's important that climate groups speak out. These things are very much related to migration justice. As I said, many of the same corporations that get military contracts are also those now being used to deport people and for violence on the borders. And of course, Palestinian solidarity right now. There's strong ties with many of these firms and with many of these issues with what is happening in Gaza right now. And I think we have to go, we have this moment where we have to also challenge the Democrats on their commitment to the size of the military footprint, because as we can see, there was no attempts to reverse this or to challenge this. And it laid the grounds for what we're seeing, like the Trump. So it's really an important moment, really, as the Democrats are in a moment of rethinking to challenge this commitment to militarism that has been very much a bipartisan affair. And the fifth thing I want to do is that we need to also look at the companies. At times we can get really stuck with political debates and party structures, but underlying this is a real growth of a military industrial complex that is now a military border industrial complex. It's now a military border tech industrial complex, and there are companies. They have shareholders. We have investments in them, our pension funds, and so on. That really underpin this order. They're the main wins of this moment. And they're also companies that really intersect with our lives in many ways. So there's ways to bring up this conversation. Just in my own district, I have a conversation next week with one of our county supervisors around the county investments to precisely bring up these issues. So it's one way that we can also raise this. But that's just the, my first kind of 5 things that I wanted to kind of put on the table. But I know that there are also some great campaigns, such as the campaign on the air shows, that would be great to hear more from Jim and Gary about, and many different other actions. So with that, I will finish and open up for questions and conversation.
Well, thank you for that, Nick. That was just beautiful. Very, very comprehensive. And I love some of the points, particularly that you made that, I haven't heard that much about. That is one of them being that the rare earth minerals are largely being used to support the military rather than, any sort of consumer projects like cars or anything like that. Anyway, beautiful, beautiful talk. And I know Lucy is going to be delighted with all of your action items. That's one thing that we look at with every talk. And I believe everything that you said on that list are things that Jim and Gary and VFP's Climate Crisis and Militarism project are addressing. But does anyone want to ask a question? It looks like Dick has his hand up. Dick, you want to go ahead? You have a question?
Yeah, just a sort of comment and question. And I'll say I listened to an interview a couple of days ago of the Quincy Institute with Representative Adam Smith. If you know, he's been the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, or whatever it's called, and is now the ranking member. And there was a lot of issues, global politics and security type things that came up. And a couple of things he said were encouraging. One is he says we need to do a lot more on diplomacy, less militarism. We need to need a strategy to coexist with China and not just view them as an enemy. But there seem to be something missing. There was no talk about restricting spending, no thought about, well, maybe we need to rethink the whole global situation. Don't we need and then this time of, we can't sustain this growth in spending and the growth in conflict. We need just the opposite. We need more cooperation to handle all the global problems these days. It seems like we need a total sort of rethinking of how we even approach the world. Do you have any ideas? Because our politicians here and abroad all seem to be grounded in the past. It's just they think like, and Trump thinks like 200 years ago. Others think like the Cold War. I mean, whereas we need something totally new, as you mentioned, like on security. We need a whole new way of thinking about how to run the world, so to speak.
Yeah. I won't jump straight in. Let's have a few thoughts and then come in to hear from others. But yeah, I'll write it down and we'll chat. I think, Eric, you're next.
I was at the outset of your presentation, I put a question in the chat about the fact that you could compare the increase in military spending with a variety of other increases and try to make an equivalency between the two. But then at the end of your presentation, you put a very effective chart up in which you compared not only military spending, but what you also called coercive spending. And you talked about increases in jails and increases in other activities to control populations. What I was wondering about is, since I sort of was overwhelmed with your presentation, which is very comprehensive, and you're to be congratulated on it, but I'm at a disadvantage because I'm only reacting to it for the first time. But I was kind of curious about your proposals for linking the need for security in the nations that seem to have the greatest assets and seem to be protecting themselves against the consequences of climate action, which I think the military has recognized has caused a tremendous threat to those economies from the underdeveloped world, as the underdeveloped populations begin to threaten the developed world. How you expect to reconcile those forces beyond what you've presented here? It seems to me there's a global crisis taking place between the have nations, which are the major climate polluters, and the have-not nations, which are the biggest victims of that pollution and whose growing populations are threatening the nations with the largest number of assets and the biggest militaries and the biggest cohorts of institutions.
Great. Jim.
Jim, I think he called for you to speak. Nick did.
Is it my turn? You want me to speak now?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a quick question, or maybe it's not a quick question or a quick answer. Just me going through briefly, I haven't analyzed it, the 2025 project, and doing a word search on climate extremism. A lot of the opposition to the USAID is their work on climate change. And this particular project seems to have a religious ferocity against dealing with climate. Do you have any explanation as to why that's the case? Thank you.
Mona.
Is it my turn to speak? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question I have, okay. So it seems to me that the big driving force here is the many companies that are in the business of the military, and so many jobs of American people depend on those companies. And I know a lot of people over by the Bangor submarine base, And the whole of Kitsap County, where I used to live and my son lives now, all their jobs depend upon this military spending. So, I mean, I don't see how you get around that because of that, the huge force of the motivation being people's employment. That's, I guess, my question and comment. Thank you.
These are all really great questions, so I'll just give my initial stab, but I'd love to, there's wisdom in this room, so others who want to add in, please do. In terms of like rethinking security, I think I totally agree, and one of the issues that we particularly looked at in the book that we did, Secure and Dispossessed, was this was the term, what was the dominance of this kind of national security view of security, and could we even use the word security? Because, and I think one of my feeling is that we have to kind of move to something. That's why I use the term collective safety, because I think we actually need to move away from the word security. Often when you use it, even if you use it in kind of good ways, they find that it actually reinforces a particular zero-sum thinking in people, which is my security, it matters more at the expense of others. So we need to, so part of this is narratives, I think, that we need to kind of reclaim a language and talk about safety, which is and this is a strong value within the Unitarians as well, that us ultimately safety and security comes through our relationships. It doesn't come through one person having it, another person not having it. So there's partly around narratives. I think in terms of the US, of course, there's a long history, very embedded structures of power, and it's a really difficult thing to start to challenge, this structural power. I do think we are increasingly going to face crises, particularly with climate change, that cannot be solved behind a border, because climate change won't respect borders. So we're dealing with something that is global, and therefore is going to impact is going to ricochet through systems, and we're going to see, and we're seeing that already in something like this tariff war that we've really had, which is this, that you can launch these things, but we're interconnected also globally. So we're going to need to find more collective responses to the challenge, and climate change most of all needs that kind of collective response. And so I think that's part of the things that we have to kind of articulate, is that what we really need is, as you say, not just the following of kind of diplomacy and cooperation, but there's a real urgency that we collaborate with China rather than turn them into enemies, because we will actually just make the situation far, far worse if we turn them into enemies, because we will exacerbate the climate crisis and will distract from any collaboration, when we all know that the only way the climate crisis can be resolved is through the collaboration of US and China. How to respond to the instability from crises and inequality, and that's, I guess, is also related to this. When you look at a lot of the military strategies, some of them create this picture, which I was looking at them recently. I don't have time right now, but they create this. Back in 2003, they create this picture that climate change will lead to a world where it's kind of sort of like a Hunger Games scenario, where everyone's against each other, where people will be fighting to survive, where desperate migrants will spill across borders, where states will disintegrate, and the US needs to kind of protect itself from this chaos. And when I was thinking, this was written in 2003 in some of the early strategies. When I think about Trump today, I think he has that worldview, that basically we have to protect ourselves from the chaos outside. and that there's only a zero-sum answer to that. That our success can only be at the expense of someone else's failure, or other people's success can only be at the expense of our failure. And so that's part of so I do think that's quite embedded, and we have to kind of change. It's again around changing narratives, because this response of trying to respond to the crisis with a militarized clampdown, what's like putting a lid on something, doesn't stop the crisis. Arming our border, we know, doesn't stop migrants needing to flee in desperate situations. So it just creates more deaths and suffering in the situation. And it works because it doesn't respond to actually the underlying sources of inequality. And what we find is that if you invest where people have invested, where there are good political structures for collaboration, where there are strong systems of social solidarity, people are much more resilient to crises than when there is a much more divisive, polarized society. Actually the most resilient societies to systems of crisis are collaborative ones rather than divisive and security-based ones. So I think that's one of the things that we also have to interject into this discussion. What's the next thing about the ferocity against the action of climate change? I think that kind of fits into this. I think part of it's if you admit that climate change is an issue, that means doing something about it. Whereas this government is very much around responding to it. It's responding to crises in a militarized way, and so therefore you don't need to admit that climate change exists. And in fact, that's detrimental. And I think it comes into that kind of zero-sum thinking. I think it's also, of course, a result of this kind of right-wing troll politics that where there's almost basically there's a performative sense of rejecting science, of rejecting empathy. Empathy is a problem, rejecting any kind of role of actually tackling causes is kind of very much embedded in this moment. It's a reactionary moment to instability rather than which cannot entertain the ideas that there might be causes, especially ones that they have no interest in tackling, which is issues of inequality, precarity, and so on. And then the last one on jobs. This is obviously, particularly in the US, this is a really tricky one. I mean, and one we're always up against. And I know, and we all know the story about how, defense industries have been scattered across in order to the country so that there would always be reasons to defend them, and that each congressman would fight because it would lose jobs and so on. So that this was a strategy, the defense industry, to make sure that it was difficult to undermine. I mean, the evidence does show that the defense industry doesn't create a lot of jobs compared to other sectors. And that the same amount of investment, and we have a huge amount of government investment, would create more jobs in other industries. But I do think there's a real challenge of the peace movement to start to look at that issues of we talk about just transition a lot, like how do we move oil workers into the green economy? We also think we also need to have much more work on how we move workers from the military economy to the peace economy. But there are some groups working on this. I'm most familiar with a group in the UK, which is working with trade unions. And, there's a history of moments like this, even going back to the 70s, where some aerospace workers working in the military industry got together in a trade union and said, we don't want to be producing weapons. This is what we want to do. And this is in the 70s, that we want to do windmills instead. And they showed how their skills were very transferable. And we need more of these kind of building these relationships with trade unions as well. Anyway, those are my thoughts, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this too.
Nick, I'd like to jump in just real quickly here, because some people are starting to leave. And that is, if any of you that are participating in this today would like to put your email or contact information in the chat so that if we do have particular things coming up that you might involve yourself in, one of them being Veterans for Peace is planning a bus tour, no more air shows. There's things like that. And this goes to Nick's point that we need to connect with one another. So I'm just inviting you to do that if you'd like to. And Lucy has her hand up next. So let's hear from Lucy.
A couple of points. First of all, I want to second your talk about collaboration and particularly mention China. I've been part of a group off and on called the Living Earth Movement, I think, that involves John Cobb, who has recently died. He's a process theologian and very much involved with China. And that group has talked about how China cares about the climate and that, you know, they've done a lot of work within their country to help with that. But that never gets mentioned in our press or any way to see that we could be building collaboration on climate with China. So that's one point. The other is my bewilderment that Trump and apparently all his staff do not even believe in climate change. I mean, they totally ignore it. If I were a prayer, I would pray that hurricanes would hit Mar-a-Lago or some way that they get hit over the head with climate, because it's all over the country, the signs of it. And yet somehow that is not reaching the administration, that this is the country's problem. So I don't know if there's any way to hit them over the head with that, but that's what I'd like to do.
Wayne, were you trying to communicate something here? I see you have things in the chat, but I can't quite make it out.
Sorry, I laid something on my keyboard.
Oh, no worries. Okay, I don't know, Nick, would you like to respond to what Lucy just presented?
No, I think they're great. I think they're important points. I think, and China's talked about. It's like many of these issues. The enemies are talked about in terms of the threats, and nothing about who they are, what they represent, whether it's migrants and their lives, or whether it's China. You don't hear other dimensions. So it's really important to, and we need to be building these kind of collaborations, people to people, as well as government to government. And I agree with Terry in the chat that I think you don't hear the same climate denialism in terms of climate change doesn't exist. They just are determined not to do anything about actually tackling it. Because
Rudyard has brought up some points in the chat that he thinks that we really need to question the profit motive in our economic system. He says, but that has much more of a chance at working as a snowball, but that has much of a chance as working as a snowball in climate heated world. So Rudyard, would you like to say anything verbally to Nick or respond at all about anything that's going on here in this presentation?
No, other than that question. Well, it's not really a question, but yeah, I just see militarism as a symptom, not a cause. I mean, I don't think they're suddenly going to turn guns into flowers unless we change the whole economic system.
yeah, I guess I would respond to that. I think they're very much interconnected, the economic system and the military system, in the same way that the oil economy and the military economy are tied together. They kind of feed off each other. And particularly this military, and particularly since 2000, and particularly since 9/11, it's become a very powerful ideology, or kind of hegemonic thinking in the US, but also internationally, that security is is needed, and they very much benefit from the economic system, benefits from it, and the military system benefits from the economic system. So they're very much tied together. I agree.
I read that the UK passed very high income taxes for World War II because the working people who were supplying the cannon fodder wouldn't bother if all they were doing was protecting wealthy people's property. And from what Rudier said, I kind of agree with him if we can get profit out of it. But good luck on that. That's not very easy. Another experience we had was we were in Hamburg and we had a friend there and he showed us around Hamburg and the nice neighborhoods were never attacked. And he said the agreement was between Hitler and the Allies was that you didn't bomb nice neighborhoods. And I think he probably knew that because he said that it was the working class that they bombed, and the nice homes were still there, which tells us who's getting protected.
Yeah. Yeah, there's one of the images I showed in that slide, which kind of captures that a little bit, is also the hurricanes. Was it Sandy? This Hurricane Sandy that hit New York? And the image, I don't know if you saw it, but was the one tower that was still lit up when the whole of it went black was one of the major banks like JP Morgan Chase, which of course had its generators and so on. So the whole of Manhattan going black, but this one big banking tower still remaining lit at that moment of hurricane, which is also kind of captures that rather viscerally. I was wondering, Gary, if I can put you on the spot a bit, because I know that going back to your to kind of Veterans for Peace and its work in terms of kind of linking with climate movements and so on. I'd love to hear a bit about your experiences of reaching out to climate movements and what's worked and what hasn't in terms of connecting with climate activists and militarism, and whether you have any lessons for us.
Oh, Gary has some great comments on our, he's done a lot of connecting, for example, with 350.org. Gary, why don't you address that?
Thank you. Excuse me. In San Diego, we have an annual air show, a military air show called the Miramar Air Show. And it started out as Navy and they brought the Blue Angels down, and it's now a Marine base. But for about 8 years ago, we started protesting it on the basis of its glorification of violence and kind of all the traditional what you would think that a peace activist group would protest an air show for. And we felt good about what we did, but we didn't get a lot of community support. 3 years ago, we changed our focus and started talking about the pollution from the Blue Angels and getting people involved with a big banner that said, "Air show fuels climate crisis." And what it did is it got people's attention because they could hear the noise, smell the exhaust, and see the pollution. And we got climate people involved in it. And last year we had 25 local organizations, including the climate subcommittee at our first UU church, 350.org, Sunrise Movement, and a lot of other local groups sign on and say, yeah, we think this is wrong, and here's why. We got people involved in the conversation, which is, what Nick is doing here. We've got to see these twin existential threats and get out of our silos and start working together. We've got to collaborate and cooperate. So last year we saw 9 organized protests, including against Seafair in Seattle, a joint effort with, I think, Extinction Rebellion, 350.org, and Veterans for Peace and others. We saw it in Portland. We saw it at the McMinnville Air Show. We saw it in Virginia Beach and other places. So this year, in fact, we had an organizational call. There's about 64 military air shows nationally, and we want to increase the number of protests, but we want to get people together. So we had people from World Beyond War, Code Pink, and 350.org on our organizational call as we look forward to how we're going to support local protests to get climate activists who are primarily a lot younger than folks like me and Veterans for Peace, because they have a lot of great ideas as well. So we see that this topic is very instrumental in getting climate activists to look at this $1 trillion pot of money, as well as the tremendous pollution that the military produces, virtually unchecked. Because, you know, going back to the Kyoto Protocol, why bother to measure military emissions? Oh, don't worry about that. So yeah, we find it's effective. We find people respond to it, but it's just to get them involved in the conversation, because the conversation's much deeper than just the air show. It's military pollution and military spending.
Oh, thank you, Gary. You know, Steve Morse isn't here, but he did also speak to this group, and he's been working on the interconnection between militarism, climate, and unions, and bringing together working people. And he's been very, very successful with that. So, you know, all of these efforts that all of us are making to connect with each other, I mean, we really are so much stronger together. And some of you that represent UUs in other parts of the country, I mean, as you know, work with your churches, work with you, you know, bring in presentations for you if you're interested. Maybe you can help support us if the bus tour for the military air shows come to your areas, that kind of thing. You know, there's a couple people that haven't spoken at all, so I just want to know, Ruth. Ruth seems to have stepped away, but she usually has something to say. And Martha, do either of you have anything at all to say? Or when? Okay. Well, I just wanted to make sure that people that haven't said anything had a chance. Lucy, you looked like you want to say something.
I just want to second the idea of having a focus on action. In Salem, we've had two types of demonstrations. One was wonderful last week on every possible thing that there was a sign for everything we're against with Trump and company. And the other one was the Tesla car sales place being focused on, so that it was only on one focus. But I think the air shows, for example, are a great idea because it brings us to one focus at a time rather than everything at once. So I like that idea of our choosing one or two things that we would focus on, that we feel like we could really get behind and build on, like this, like the military, for example.
Is this something that we could get UU in general to pass out to local congregations about this opportunity, to have Nick speak or our group speak?
We can certainly try from our end to get that to happen. But we need a plan, we need a way they can be involved.
Yeah, Tina, I see you nod your head, and I know you're the minister of your church in Arizona. You know, so I mean, you know, I'm sure, you know, some of the individuals that were here today, I don't know if Nick would be interested, but I know Gary and Jim would be. We've got people from BFP that speak on this, and they really would love to be able to speak to the UU churches. So I don't know, Nick, is that something that you would be open to as well?
Yeah, definitely. I can, yeah, no, happy to help out. And sometimes it depends a bit on schedules and things like that, but if there's bits
There
I can
might be
do,
a
I'm
way to
happy.
show a video, you know. You could have a service
Well,
that's you one day. We'd pay
one I can share one also resource that there's it was with a bunch of people, but just Al Jazeera did a feature, a series documentary called All Hail the Military or something like that. But it was quite, it was it interviewed me, but a whole bunch of other people, and it's quite a good, you know, it's just a little video that you could share that kind of tells quite a lot of the story in a more succinct way than just today. So I'll
Could you
put that in
share
the chat
that
too.
that link with us?
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat now. I don't know if you've seen it, Gary. Anyway, it's a good little like clip that you could use for just to introduce the issue to people.
Thank you. That's helpful.
For example, if you know where all the air shows are, I did get a list from.
I do. Give me your email. I'll send it to you.
And I think Gary, you had important points about like it's also about language, again, narratives, but you know, sometimes climate change even can be a bit of an abstract issue, whereas polluting the air, which is it's the same thing, but it makes it a bit more local to someone. This is in my local atmosphere, this pollution is happening. So that's also one of the ways of kind of doing it. And then, yeah, like Gary said, listening, sharing, and going to where people are already active and gathering is a key strategy.
Okay, it sounds like we're maybe near the end. Thank you, Nick, and everybody who came. It was quite enlightening. I'm going to put on the closing screen so people know how to find us. I hope I'm not cutting anybody off. Is there anything more that needs to be said before I do that?
Well, I just think we should really give. Oh, there, Ruth is back. Hi, Ruth. We're about ready to wrap this thing up, and you didn't say anything at all during this meeting. Did you have something you wanted to say other than your intro? You're muted. I guess not. Okay, all right. I guess.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't have anything. It's always good to hear what everybody's doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruth. Glad you joined us, and thank you all for coming. And that was just amazing. Thank you very, very much, Nick.
Well, thank you for joining, and lovely to meet you all. Hope our paths cross again soon.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for organizing, Cindy.